Hello, friends. Welcome to the Nope Coach podcast. I'm your host, Suzanne Culberg, joined today by Tatiana Garcia, and we're going to talk about high functioning anxiety because I personally have never heard it framed that way until I've chatted to Tatiana before. And I know you talk about high functioning anxiety and high achievers. So I'd love to start with definitions because I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, many people who I would define as high achievers themselves would not call them that. Like, I think high achievers is almost this clandestine group because you're always thinking if you are actually a high achiever, well, there's so much more I could do. So to start us off with this conversation, how would you define high functioning anxiety?
Yeah, and if it's okay, I'm actually going to start with high achievers because
Yes, please do. Yes.
because high high achievers understanding that's necessary to understand high functioning anxiety.
Love it.
And it's funny because somebody just asked me like, "Oh, what would you?" I think it was in a YouTube comment, like, "What would you define as a high achiever?" And I don't know if anybody had ever asked me that before, and I was like, "Well," because I always thought it was like, well, somebody who's high achieving, but it's true that I think there is nuance in understanding it, and maybe somebody who it is high achieving and appears that way on the outside, they may not consider themselves to be that way. But I think in general, it's somebody who tends to go above and beyond in what they're doing, whether that is work or school or other responsibilities. They tend to have high expectations for themselves, and they tend to kind of be the person who is focused on achievement and success and growth and moving forward. So there's not necessarily a particular measure or anything for this. It's oftentimes something that people will self-identify, or maybe other people will view them in that way because of like their outward success.
I love
So,
that. I'm going to jump in there. High expectations of themselves. See, it's so funny. Someone said to me once offhand about being a high achiever. And I was like, I'm not a high achiever. And this is why it was all interesting because, as you said, self-identifying. And they're like, you've got, a top 2% global podcast. You've got, you put content all the time. You've avid course creator, all of these things. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, so what is a high achiever if not that? And that's why I loved your frame there. It's like, yeah, I've got super high expectations of myself because there always could be more, but not more as in not being satisfied with where you're at. So I think sometimes, a high achiever, like you look at somebody, Oprah, or, a really big name with a huge following, Taylor Swift, like, oh, they're such a high achiever because they're internationally known. Whereas I don't know, a regular person, I might not identify as being a high achiever, but totally would to say I've got high expectations of myself. So I love that as a frame to start the conversation.
yeah, exactly. And I think, of course, there can be different levels when it comes to high achiever. And I think it's not necessarily about like what level of like success or accomplishments you're achieving, but a lot of times it's about the mindset and the effort that you're putting in. Um, and of course, achievement is a part of that. And now, as we kind of connect that with high functioning anxiety, so that is when somebody is high achieving. And so that's the behavior that they're putting in, that is how they appear on the outside to others, but that's contrasted with how they feel on the inside. And on the inside, there's often a lot of potentially turmoil. Maybe they're feeling anxious, they're overthinking things, they're doubting themselves, they're experiencing imposter syndrome. And a lot of times, what is propelling that desire for achievement and continuing to push harder and work more is the fear of oftentimes failure, the fear of criticism, the fear of not being good enough. And so, all of those fears are kind of pushing them forward to continue to push themselves harder, overworking, maybe over planning, overthinking things. I like to call it like the overs of just continuing to do more and more. And oftentimes it's at the expense of themselves. So at the expense of taking care of themselves, prioritizing their own needs. And that can oftentimes lead to burnout. It can lead to feeling, overwhelmed constantly and feeling really stressed and depleted.
And I think that's such a great way of looking at it because we can't see anxiety. Like if somebody has a broken limb that's in a cast, you can see that. I'm like, oh, maybe they need some accommodations to, get onto the bus or, public transport or, you can see that. But anxiety is often internal. And I love the high functioning anxiety because it's like, well, you can't be anxious. You get so much done. Like when I tell people that I have anxiety, the number of people who tell me that I don't, or I tell people I'm an introvert and they're like, oh, but you're so, it's like, I love people trying to tell you how you are. Like they tell you their perception of you, but what's actually happening inside your own head, only you know that. And then when people, I love that people are more open and sharing about their experiences because it's just like, oh, wow, I thought I was the only one. And then someone else shares it. So, the question I was going to ask is, how does like high functioning anxiety differ from what people would classically think of when they think of anxiety or define anxiety?
So, one of the main differences is just in how it affects your behavior. So, somebody with anxiety that you might classically think of and high functioning anxiety can meet the criteria for, let's say, a diagnosable anxiety disorder. So that, there can be overlap there. However, the difference is in what I mentioned before of like that propelling forward. A lot of times with anxiety, that fear results in avoidance. So let's say somebody who is anxious about social situations. So they may avoid, you know, going out to a party or like anything that puts them in a type of situation that makes them anxious. Whereas with high functioning anxiety, it's a form of avoidance, but because they're avoiding like fear, or not fear, because they're avoiding like failure, dropping the ball, things like that, the behavior is doing more, is pushing themselves forward as opposed to kind of holding themselves back. And oftentimes it's like because there's this strong fear of, well, what if I don't do enough? Or, I don't want to regret not trying for this opportunity. Then that's kind of what's putting it in the realm of like the high functioning part of continuing to try and do more.
So the high achievement aspect of like the fear of failure or, of not trying hard enough or whatever is the more driving than the anxiety about speaking on stage or going to a party or something. So they'll still do the thing. Like sometimes the more classic anxieties, my daughter has social anxiety. So getting her to go to things, is challenging, and she's about to start high school. So it's going to be a whole transition. And then working with the school to say once she's in and she's comfortable and she's familiar, you won't know, but that transition piece will be really hard. But with the high functioning anxiety, that won't be a draw card enough for them not to do it because the failure will be driving them more. That fear. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah.
I get that. Yes, I get
Mhm.
that. So, how did you come to this understanding? Like, what's your journey been with this for yourself personally? Because I know a little bit about your story, but the listeners don't. So,
Mhm. Yeah. So this is something that I have personally experienced myself, and I didn't really ever characterize it as high functioning anxiety until maybe like 4 or 5 years ago when I first learned about the term. But especially starting in grad school was when I found myself, and I started my internship and field work, and then working as a therapist. So my background is that I am a licensed therapist, and I found myself in this kind of pattern of really pushing myself really hard, especially when I first started working as a therapist after I had just graduated grad school, and being in this place of like constantly doubting myself and overthinking, but then like over preparing for all of my sessions because I didn't want to mess up or make a mistake, or be perceived as like that I didn't know what I was doing. And so I was so afraid of that judgment and failure and messing up and making mistakes that like I was in this place where I felt kind of like on edge and really anxious, but nobody else would have known looking at me. And, I continued to kind of like move up the ladder to where I got to the point where then I was in a position that I was doing a lot of great work, but it just wasn't a good fit for me personally. And so I realized that, okay, even though everybody, and at least in my experience, it's like, okay, you just get a position and then you move up the ladder, you become a manager, and then, that's the route. But I realized that when I reached a point of burnout, essentially, and I was just like, I remember this moment where I was in my car driving home from work and I just kind of I got a call from work and it was like some minor request, but I just reached this breaking point. It was like the straw that broke the camel's back. And I started to like cry and get super angry. And like I had a point where I was like, okay, I don't think my job should be affecting my mental health and emotions to this degree. And that was when I realized something needs to change. And that was when I transitioned into doing private practice and then eventually, my coaching practice. But then at that point was when I really started. I've always been, as somebody who's like a high achiever, I've always been really devoted to personal growth and development and practicing what I preach. So when I started learning about different therapeutic techniques, I would always like practice and learn them on myself and, do things like the meditation practices and changing the way I was thinking about things. And so that's always been a part of my journey. But then I kind of really started diving into understanding more about the unique challenges that face individuals who are in this place of being like high performing, high achieving, and how a lot of people I think don't understand it because they see that, okay, everything looks great on the outside, but how there can also simultaneously be this internal and potentially external pressure that makes it difficult to seek out help, to say no, to, take care of your own needs and all of this that I think is kind of like uniquely important for somebody that's in that place.
So many good things you mentioned there. A couple that I want to bring attention to is the, like, I can't remember how you phrase it exactly, but the, over preparing. So, preparing and then preparing and then preparing, over preparing. Like, I was in a cycle of that for quite some time, and it's exhausting. And sometimes it's not until somebody makes an offhand comment or you listen to an episode like this and you're like, oh, there's a word for that. That, like, even with the high functioning anxiety. So you might be like, I've looked at traditional anxiety, it doesn't really fit because, as you said, I still do the thing. I turn up, I go, I attend. I don't enjoy it, and inside I'm screaming, but I'm more driven by that fear of failure than, and there is something to do that. So sometimes when you hear a word, I'm not saying that that's healing in and of itself or, whatever, but that can just be that. I get it. I remember the first time I heard the term rejection sensitivity. And I was
Mm.
like, where has this been all my life? And then I found a whole series of books and podcasts. And I was like, oh, other people feel like this too, because these are things that you can't see externally. And the other thing you mentioned about, getting help when you are high achieving, when everything looks perfect on the outside or looks really good or is good, but inside doesn't match up to that, when you start to approach people for help, sometimes I'm keen to hear your thoughts on this. It's been my experience because the people you go to have a perception of you, they don't get it, and it can kind of be twisted around, and you end up inadvertently coaching them for free or helping them when you've hired them as a service provider. The number of times that has happened to have, really good boundaries and say, actually, this is, because they're like, they have an image of you. So to get help that actually feels supportive rather than inadvertently turning it around or getting caught up with their thoughts and ideas and suggestions for, how it should look rather than what feels good for you. So yeah, has that ever happened where, you've inadvertently hired help and then become the support person?
You know what? I actually luckily haven't had that experience. But I can definitely like I've worked with clients and had that happen in like personal relationships where kind of I tend to be the helper and like tend to have difficulty with like opening up and sharing my issues and asking for help and support. So I've definitely experienced that kind of dynamic. And I think another piece of it is also that people who tend to be in this place of high achieving tend to be in these roles that can feel like isolating. So whether it's you're self-employed or maybe you're a leader in some sense, you know, those can tend to be roles where there's not as much support because either you're at like the top of the chain, so to speak, or you're just doing it alone. And so I think because of that, that can be inherently difficult and then make you kind of reinforce this idea like, oh, I don't need to ask for help. That's like a sign of weakness. I need to do it all on my own.
That point, talk more to that. Like, I think this is something conditionally, societally, that asking for help is a sign of weakness. And I used to feel like that. And then it's like, actually, someone said to me once, sometimes it's the most offhand comments that can just stay with you or can have a perspective shift, like, the wording of rejection sensitivity or the wording of high functioning anxiety. Someone said to me, I needed help with something or other, and I was like, I don't want to be needy. I can't ask for help. And she just looked me up and down. She's like, so what does that say when people ask you for help? Like, what are you thinking about them without wording it? Are you thinking people are needy? And I'm
Mm.
like, oh, I love helping people. And she's like, and why wouldn't people love helping you? So, asking for help, like, you know, or I could do it myself, but I don't want to. Like, we're recording this in the morning time for me because I know it's the afternoon, evening for you because global. And so
Mhm.
I said to my husband, can you take the kids to school? Because I want to record a podcast. He's like, yeah, sure. Like, I could have had us meet earlier or, whatever, but like, I wanted that help. I think sometimes we wait until we need it or it's desperate. And then it's like, why not ask for something because it's what you desire?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what you're bringing up is a good point, and I think part of it is that it's vulnerable to ask for help, and people can perceive it because I think socially, culturally, however you want to view it, that asking for help means that you're flawed or deficient in some way because you should be able to do it on your own. When of course that's not truth because at the end of the day we're all only, one person. We can't possibly do it all. And actually asking for help is a sign of strength because that means that you can acknowledge that you can't do it all. And there's nothing wrong with that because somebody who has trouble asking for help, and I've totally been there, um, is feeling oftentimes this sense of insecurity that, well, if I do ask for help, then people are going to find out that, like, oh, I can't do it all, or like I'm not good enough, or whatever that kind of like inner fear could be.
I think that's such a great point because, yeah, if we normalize, as you said, asking for help, we're only one person. We physically cannot do it all, nor do we. Like, we have so many modern things that make tasks that used to take all day. Like, dumb example, but yesterday I was doing the washing or the laundry, depending on where you live in the world. And I was just, as much as I still don't like pegging it out on the line, I was like, in days of old, I would have been down by a river, like doing this on the rocks, like this task that the machine did for me. And some people don't even put it outside on the line; they put it straight into a dryer. So like, it's your involvement in this task is to transfer it from one machine to another. I prefer the stuff dried outside because I think it smells better. And anyway, random weird thing that I like the stuff dried outside, but it's like I don't ask the washing machine for help because I've paid for it and it's, a thing in my house. But there are so many things, modern conveniences, driving a vehicle. Like, imagine if I had to walk everywhere, like it'd be taking my kids to school and back, or you're going to get groceries, all of these things, the things that I can do in a day now literally could have taken months or years in times of old. So we already
Mhm.
are asking for help in so many ways, but we don't realize it because we've gotten used to the conveniences. So, and also too, a lot of these things used to be done by a village. Like people would be in charge of the cooking for everybody. People would be in charge of the washing for everybody. And now we're all, as you said, quite isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these tasks that we're taking care of or given to different people are all done by one. So I
Yeah.
think it's acknowledging that, we aren't an island. We're social beings, and looking at when people ask you for help, how do you feel? I'm not saying always, I'm like, yeah, let's do it. It depends on the task. But then with clear boundaries and being able to say no and differentiate between, yes, this is something that I do, but it's a paid service, or yes, this is something that I do, but not for friends and family. But like having these filters and conversations, and starts with you, what feels good and what doesn't feel good. Because like if someone said to me, could you bake me a cake for my birthday? That would not feel good. I did drip cakes before they were cool. Like the first time someone showed me a drip cake with the icing or frosting, whatever you call it, I was like, mine
Mm-hmm.
looks like that because I'm just not very skilled.
That's
So
funny.
when people, I'm curious about when people are experiencing this, like things like burnout and stuff are being talked about a lot more, but where when would you recommend people start to seek help, speaking of asking for help or things? Because I don't think you necessarily want to wait until you're crying in the car or just can't take it anymore. Like, what are the signs you think people are circling that need for, help with their high achieving, getting in the way of them actually achieving, or anxiety, like high functioning anxiety?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question because a lot of times this can feel normal if it's just what you're used to, because it can become familiar for people to be functioning in this way. But I think signs that you might benefit from support, first, I would just want to say there's no like minimum amount of struggle that you need to qualify for to get support. So I want to emphasize that because I think, especially when it comes to whether it's going to therapy or any other type of support, a lot of people can think, well, oh, it needs to be really bad for me to get help. And that's not always the case. Like you can reach out for support at any point. Some specific signs when it comes to high functioning anxiety could be that it is negatively affecting your days. Maybe you're waking up and feeling anxious. Maybe you're having trouble with getting work done or focusing because you're overthinking things, or it is spilling over into your personal life. Let's say if you're having trouble with, like, a lot of the clients that come to me, they are really like, work is an important part of their lives, and then it can become like too much. It kind of flows over into their weekends, and they are continuing to like maybe stay up at night worrying and thinking about work, and can't get it off of their mind, can't stop thinking about their to-do list, and worrying about the things that have to get done. And it can also look like physical symptoms that can manifest as a result of stress and anxiety. So maybe that's tension in your body, or headaches, or digestive issues, or other health problems that can come from chronic stress. And it can also look like changes in your behavior. So maybe you're taking out your stress, frustration, or anything else on those that are close to you, like your loved ones. And maybe it is negatively impacting just your mood, and how you're feeling on a day to day basis. Maybe you're feeling exhausted or depleted, and it could just make it harder for you to feel your best and have time for the things that you love, whether that's hobbies or your relationships, or anything else that's important to you.
I love all of that, but most particularly that there isn't a minimum standard. I think sometimes, like back in my dieting days, I haven't weighed myself in nearly a decade now, and I'm so proud of that. But in my dieting days, I had that number, that number on the scale. When I reached that number, that's when I would, start a diet, get some help or whatever. But the fact that you're mentioning, especially if you're high functioning, a high achiever, your norm might not be the norm. And if you love it and it's working for you, you do you. But sometimes I'm thinking of that meme and I can't think of what it's from, but basically there's so many variations of it. And the one I saw recently, it was like I got paid this much. I got paid that much. I got paid this much. And the dude's like, you get paid for this? Do you know what I mean? So it could be like, you know, like, because what to you has just been your whole life. When you
Mhm.
start to get help, or when you start to work with someone such as yourself, or you know, somebody else, and you're like, wow, I liken it to, I wear contact lenses now, but I used to have glasses, and I didn't know that I needed glasses because that's how my vision had always been. And eventually in year 10, so I was like 15, I was starting to get some headaches, things were hard. The teacher suggested to my parents, when was the last time she had an eye test? And they're like, I should take her for an eye test. Anyway, long story short, went in, eye test. You need glasses, love. I remember walking outside with the glasses on and being like, oh, the trees have leaves on them. You know, and my mum was like, what? And I just seen this green blur because that's how I had lived my life. So you might be listening to
Yeah.
this and you might be like, yeah, I really identify with that high functioning anxiety. I've never felt like anxious. It's never held me back from doing the thing, but I have felt extreme imposter syndrome, fear of failure, driven to the point where I'm not actually enjoying the thing that I do. I think for me, that is a signpost for me. If I have achieved the thing and I'm not like excited by it, my husband or my kids are more excited than me, and I'm like, oh. So when you do get that help, that support, and you start to talk to someone, you could have the trees have leaves on the moment where you're like, oh wow. And then that the tiny little shifts can make such a big impact on your life. So
Mhm.
if people listen to this and go, okay, I've identified that I do want to make a change. Actually, you've got a quiz. Tell us about that, because I know it's called a high functioning anxiety quiz, but I don't know anything about it, because maybe that might help people identify. So tell us about the quiz.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. So it's a free quiz, basically kind of like checkbox of what the signs of high functioning anxiety are. And you can take that quiz and then it will let you know, yes, you have high functioning anxiety. No, you don't. Of course, this isn't a diagnostic tool or anything because high functioning anxiety isn't actually a mental health diagnosis. It's more of a tool to help you to understand more about yourself. And then you will get more resources to help you to know, okay, what are the next steps that I should take?
I love that. And I think that I really encourage you to go check out Tatiana's quiz and do that, because yeah, it will take you through the next steps. And as you said, like, I think there's so much more awareness today of things like, it's not you're this or you're that, like, spectrum in many things. There's a spectrum, there's an anxiety spectrum, like, because also too, I think the individual has a lot to play with it. Like, when you look at how much one person can do, or something that somebody can go through, which to them is quite traumatic. Like, I'm thinking, if I went out on stage and I forgot what I was supposed to say and I stood there blindly, I would beat myself up about that mentally for ages. Whereas other people would be like, oh, it's no big deal. That happens. But, you know,
Mhm.
how do you experience that? And I think, you know, anxiety being very, very internal. Like, I've got, you know, two kids, they couldn't be more different. But some of the things that to my daughter, she was like, I can't get out of bed for a week. Like, I can't, I need to change schools. My son would be like, it happens. And I think this is part of the thing for you. If it's not affecting you, or if it's not, you know, drawing back from your feeling of success and your feeling of achievement, and because this is an internal thing, versus it's like never enough and you're always trying to do more to prove to prove to who? Like, who is the
Yeah,
person knocking on the
exactly.
door saying you don't do enough? It's like, I do heaps. um I love this. So apart from the quiz, because obviously I encourage everyone to check that out, let the listeners know what it is that you do and how they can find more about that.
So, as I mentioned before, I am a licensed therapist. I'm licensed in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So, if you live in either of those states, I also am a coach, though. So, I'm a high functioning anxiety coach, and I help clients who are struggling with, feeling calmer, being more present in their lives, wanting to improve their work life balance and confidence. And I also have online courses in a community to help individuals with high functioning anxiety as well. And I have a podcast called Calmly Coping that you can find wherever you listen to podcasts or on YouTube. Suzanne was actually a guest. And I talk all about high functioning anxiety and how to thrive as a high achiever there. And I also
I,
have an Instagram and, all those social media links.
I was going to say, definitely check out Tatiana's podcast. It's sometimes you just listen to something and you're just nodding along and it's so affirming and it's so reassuring, and that in itself can be such a shift. But then, taking the next steps, if you feel so called, joining the community, trying one of the courses, but just having a space where you realize I'm not alone. Because the thing that's really stood out for me from this conversation is it can feel very isolating, especially, if you're a solopreneur, entrepreneur, work for yourself, or if you're high up in leadership and you don't necessarily have that community. And I think in a world where we've become more connected than ever, like, you can literally chat to anyone across the world in real
Mhm.
time, we can feel so disconnected because we tend to have these surface level conversations, but choosing the space where you can be fully you, like, I'm not necessarily saying go dump all this on your boss or your colleague or whatever, like choosing the audience with what you share to get the support that feels supportive is really, really valuable and important and life changing.
Yeah.
So, anything you want to say before we finish up? Like any like last takeaways, or like if people listen to this and okay, one thing you wanted them to take away from it, what would it be?
I think the one takeaway would be that it's okay to take care of yourself and to take time for yourself and to have to talk about prioritizing yourself. And I think a lot of people can have like a automatic like, oh no to that, like that's too selfish, or I need to take care of others first. And in theory that sounds nice, but in practice it's kind of the cliche of, you can't pour with an empty cup. And in order to actually help to fuel your goals of what matters to you, and whether that's achievement or, helping people or whatever it is that's important to you, you need to take care of yourself. And in whatever way that looks like, whether it's taking a few minutes for yourself here and there, asking for more support, or just acknowledging that, all right, I'm struggling right now. Even just acknowledging and validating that can be a huge step.
I think that is so important, and it links in with the asking for help, and also too, it's modeling for if you have children, for children, for
Mhm.
people in your workplace, for your family, for your colleagues, for your friends, that, it is okay to struggle. Struggle isn't a competition. Struggle doesn't mean anything about you, personally, but it's also okay to say no, to put yourself first, because people can ask someone else. Like we're saying, ask for help. Yes, do that. But also, people saying no doesn't mean anything about you, and you saying no to others. Like, I used to never be able to say no to people because I felt so guilty that, like, oh, I'm their last resort or whatever. So, no, they can ask someone else. So,
Mhm.
it's kind of like more, yeah, it's in service to everybody for you to put yourself first without feeling selfish, and yeah, have that self-care. So I love that as a take-home message for everyone. Thank you so much for joining me, Tatiana. Thank you everyone for listening. I'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.